Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how to propagate Clivia plants. So this will be focusing on division. You can also propagate them through seeds as well, but the easiest way for most people will be through division. So this is a Clivia plant. What will happen over the years is as it grows it will send out little side shoots. Once these side shoots are large enough, you can then separate them from the main plant and you'll have a whole new plant for yourself. So Clivias, although they look like most types of lilies and plants that have bulbs, it looks very similar to an amaryllis. It doesn't actually have a bulb. What it has is a lot of thick tuberous roots, so it does propagate a little bit differently than how you'd expect most lilies and most plants that look like this. So this plant here is ready for propagation. There's actually 3 plants. One of them is still a bit young and it might not be ready, but the second one is definitely old enough. You can see here we've got the 2 main plants left and right, and in the middle there's a very young one coming up as well. So I'm going to go ahead now and propagate this. The first thing we need to do is take it out of the pot and see how the root system looks, and then we can start thinking about how to separate it. So with Clivia plants, the roots can get quite large and they get quite strong against the side of the pot. Sometimes it can be difficult to take them out, so just gently squeeze the pot, try and ease it out a bit, tip it upside down, and then you should be able to pull it out. So you can see here, these are the roots of the Clivia plant. This one's definitely needing repotting. There's little compost left, it's nearly just all roots. So what you want to do is any loose compost, just let it fall away naturally. You just want to try and tease out as many roots as you can. And what you're wanting to do is try and get some separation between these plants so that you're ready to then separate them. We'll just tease these roots out. Now they are very brittle roots, so you have to be quite careful when doing this. Try not to break too many. And what you're wanting to do is, you'll notice there's a bit of movement there between the two of them, that they're no longer strongly connected. So I can then gently pull them apart. There'll be a snapping noise and that will be the 2 coming apart. So I'll just do this now. There we go. And I can gently tease it apart. So we've got one plant there. You can see where it originally connected. There's just that little section there which is white. That's where it connected. So this is now a new plant. And then we can see we've got this one as well, which is actually just snapped off by accident. So this one was actually a little bit young, but it is just about old enough that it can be propagated into a new plant. So you can see there, it's got its own root system, so it is ready. But I would ideally like to wait a little bit longer so it's got a really good root system before you do propagate it. So that's how you tell. You have a look at the base. If you've got a new offshoot coming off, see if it's got any of its own roots. If it does have its own roots, then it's ready for propagating and you can put it in its own pot. So I'm going to pot this Clivia up now. So what you want is a nice free draining compost. Clivia plants are quite drought resistant and they like very free draining soil. If the roots are wet at any point, they're really going to rot off and die. It's not quite as free draining as a succulent and cacti compost because they do need a reasonable amount of water to grow well, but you certainly don't want them sitting in a rich multi-purpose compost that's going to be too wet for them. So you want to make sure you've got a really free draining mix. What I've got here is about 50% multi-purpose compost, so it's got plenty of nutrients and water retention. I've then added about 20% perlite to make sure it's nice and free draining. And the remaining 30% is bark chips that also add to the free draining mix. And the bark chips I just got from an orchid growing compost. So to pot up the new plant, what you want to do is carefully position it in the pot. You just want to spread out the roots evenly so that they're distributed throughout the soil. Hold it in position with one hand, and with the other hand you want to pour in the compost. So when it comes to depth, you want to be burying this slightly, so where the leaves start to separate, that's about the depth that you want the compost. If you just covered up that very bottom bit there, it would be too loose and it would fall over in the new pot. So you need to make sure that it's covered up to around about that depth where the leaves are starting to separate. So this is a bit low, so I'll just top it up. Double check the height again. That looks about right. So I'm just going to hold it with one hand and put in the compost with the other hand. Now because of how delicate the roots are on this, I don't want to push down hard and damage the roots. I also don't want to compact the compost too much because that will stop its free draining ability. So I'm just going to give it a shake, make sure it's distributed around the roots and there's no air gaps. I'll just give it a very slight press down as well. And you can see there I need a little bit more compost, so I'm just going to continue filling. So that's now repotted to the correct height and it's ready to grow on in its own pot, and within a year or so this will be large enough to have its own flowers. So I'll just show you in this one as well. This is the more mature plant. There's a lot more roots, so it's a bit more difficult to get all the compost in, but you just want to put in the compost so it's covering it, and then give it a really good shake, and all that compost will just settle through. As you can see, it starts disappearing between all the different roots. Just keep doing that until you got that compost nicely settled in amongst all those roots. So that's the 3 Clivia plants now separated and repotted up into their own pots. So the 2 at the back will be definitely large enough to flower this year. The one at the front will hopefully flower in a couple of years' time. So that's all it takes to separate and propagate your Clivia plants. What will happen is every year or 2 they will send up a new shoot. It will look very much like this one here, just a very small thing with small leaves. After about a year or so's growth, it will be big enough to then separate into its own pot. And you want to keep doing this with your Clivia plants if you want to keep propagating them. Now you can keep them quite pot bound for a while. They don't mind being too pot bound, and they sometimes flower a little bit better if they are pot bound. But if you want to rapidly propagate them and get more plants, then this is a great way to do it. And you can just keep doing it year after year. I started with one of these plants about 20 years ago, and I now have propagated probably 10 or 20 or more plants from that. And that's without me trying to even rapidly propagate them. If I was to propagate them every year, which you can do if they're growing quickly, you can easily have hundreds of plants after 10 or 20 years.